in your book, you explain that and you dive into that. But then perhaps the layperson is more familiar with this next question, which is your book also deals with the concept of sola scriptura, which is often understood and sometimes controversial. Can you define what sola scriptura?
First, I'll just put a basic definition on the table, and then I'll elaborate on the way people often think about it that muddies the waters. So the way I would understand sola scriptura, and I refer to this as canonical sola scriptura to distinguish it from other conceptions that I consider to be erroneous, is that sola scriptura is the view that scripture is the uniquely normative rule and standard of faith and practice. That means that it is a norm, it's normative, it has normative authority in a unique way that other sources, other ingredients of theology do not have and cannot have. That's canonical sola scriptura in a nutshell. Now, that's distinguished from two really significant misunderstandings of sola scriptura. Sometimes when people hear the word sola scriptura, especially critics of the concept, they immediately think that it means merely scripture alone, and that scripture is only
Mhm.
alone, such that you could read scripture or do theology in a way that is entirely unaffected by tradition, entirely affected by your own reason or experience or presuppositions. Of course, that is impossible, right? The very language we're using is involving our faculty of reason. It's also been passed down to us, whether our native language or a language we pick up secondhand, that has been passed down to us. So we can't escape some influence of using our faculty of reason. We can't escape some influence of tradition or even our experience. Uh, but ideally, we would allow scripture to rule over those other factors. And that's what canonical sola scriptura is saying, is that scripture should be granted as far as possible ruling authority over any tradition, over my very faculty of reason. I should be testing it by scripture rather than testing scripture by my reason, over and against my experience. So the first view I'm rejecting is what might be called reductionistic sola scriptura, or if people read in the literature, they might hear it referred to as solo scriptura, which actually doesn't work in
Mhm.
Latin, but it's kind of a play on words, like or nuda scriptura, or
Mhm.
sometimes it's referred to as tradition zero, which means you have no view of tradition that's operating at all. So that's impossible. And there are maybe some people think they're coming to scripture and they're just reading it without any presuppositions. But that kind of view actually tends to allow people to baptize their presuppositions, because what they don't realize is that often they're bringing presuppositions, like they might read Genesis 1:1 and they already have a presupposition about what God is like, and they're reading that into the text instead
Mhm.
of allowing scripture to rule over their presuppositions. On the other extreme, on the other side, is what I call communitarian sola scriptura. And communitarian sola scriptura is a view held by some Protestants who claim to hold sola scriptura, but what they mean by that is that sola scriptura still has to be, our interpretation of scripture, I should say, has to be guided by some community determined extra canonical rule. So that we need to read scripture in keeping with some community or some rule that is prescribed by a particular community, whether it's tradition or a creed or a particular
Mhm.
rule of faith. Now, in that view, uh, they may be saying formally that scripture has prime authority, but in practice, what actually has the authority? If we go back to the analogy I
Yes.
used earlier of the syllabus, it's the arbiter or the interpretive rule outside of scripture that's actually having authority. And so I always raise a question, but I haven't gotten an acceptable answer. How can scripture be uniquely authoritative if you have a rule outside of scripture by which you interpret scripture? It just doesn't work. It actually undermines the authority of scripture, whether or not those who advocate that view intend that or not. So I advocate instead canonical sola scriptura, which is that scripture is uniquely normative over and against every other ingredient. And so if you think of sola scriptura, it means by scripture alone. And so one way of thinking of canonical sola scriptura is that scripture stands alone in at least three ways. It stands alone as being unique, as the only infallible source that is collectively available. It stands alone as being unique relative to its sufficiency. So scripture alone provides a sufficient and fully trustworthy basis of theology. And it stands alone as being the final norm of theological interpretation. It's uniquely normative, and nothing else should be the norm over and above it when it comes to other ingredients and sources, right? Save God alone, who is the one
Mhm.
who gives scripture that authority. Now, that needs to be distinguished from a number of things that I do not mean when I say canonical sola scriptura. I do not mean by that that scripture is the only source of knowledge itself. There is general revelation. We can learn things from history and experience. It does not mean that all theological doctrines or church practices require a direct biblical statement. It does not mean that we ignore what we might learn from other communities in the past, and it does not exclude our reason or take the naive
Mhm.
view that Scripture requires no interpretation, or that one's private interpretation of Scripture is the correct understanding of Scripture. It denies those things. It just says simply that Scripture is to be the uniquely normative rule of faith and practice. That means that in our theological interpretation, in our faith and practice, we should intentionally subject every other source, every other ingredient, every other factor, as far as possible, to be ruled by Scripture. That's what it means in a nutshell.